Imagine waking up one morning with a fever so intense that your entire body hurts. Your chest feels heavy, your skin burns, and every breath takes effort. Today, you would probably recognize that something is wrong and look for medical help. You might see a doctor, take a test, receive a diagnosis, and begin treatment. But imagine living in a world where none of those concepts exist. There are no hospitals, no microscopes, no antibiotics, no laboratory tests, and no word for bacteria or viruses. You become sick, and everyone around you is forced to watch without knowing what invisible force is attacking you. Yet humans lived this way for almost the entirety of our species' history. So how did they survive? The strange answer is that they did not need to understand disease in order to develop ways of surviving it. They had something much older than medicine, observation, experience, cooperation, and generations of accumulated knowledge. And the deeper we look into the archaeological record, the more surprising this becomes. Ancient humans were not simply helpless victims waiting for modern medicine to appear. They lived alongside infectious disease, traumatic injuries, parasites, dental infections, and other physical problems for thousands of generations, and sometimes they found remarkably effective ways to respond even when they had no idea what was happening inside the body. We know disease existed long before doctors because disease leaves traces. Sometimes those traces appear in bones. A skeleton cannot tell us exactly what a person felt, but it can preserve evidence of inflammation, injury, infection, abnormal bone growth, and long-term disease. Paleopathologists use these changes to reconstruct parts of ancient people's lives. The evidence is incomplete because many infections never affect bone, and even when disease does affect the skeleton, the signs may be ambiguous. But some conditions leave unmistakable patterns. Tuberculosis, for example, can produce characteristic damage to the spine, joints, and ribs, and researchers have identified ancient cases through a combination of skeletal changes, and molecular biomarkers. Evidence reviewed from paleopathology indicates that human tuberculosis is ancient and may have been present in human populations tens of thousands of years ago, although the exact early history of the disease remains an area of research. That means our ancestors were already confronting serious infections long before anyone understood germs. But surviving disease was not simply about having a strong immune system. One of the most important protections humans had was behavior. When a person became sick, the people around them could respond to what they observed. Someone who was too weak to walk could be carried. Someone with an infected wound could receive attention. Someone who could no longer hunt might still be fed. Someone who was elderly or injured could remain near the group instead of being abandoned. We sometimes imagine prehistoric life as a brutal competition where the weak were simply left behind, but archaeology repeatedly gives us reasons to question that picture. Healed injuries show that some people survived serious trauma that would have required time, rest, and assistance from others. A person with a broken bone cannot simply decide to keep hunting as if nothing happened. Someone had to help that individual obtain food, remain sheltered, and recover. This is one reason social cooperation may have been one of humanity's most important medical technologies long before medicine existed. A modern doctor can save a life with drugs and equipment. A prehistoric group could sometimes save a life simply by staying with the injured person long enough for the body to heal. And the body itself was doing an enormous amount of work. The human immune system evolved long before modern civilization. Long before anyone knew what an infection was, the body already knew how to fight many infections. Fever, inflammation, clotting, immune cells, antibodies, and other defenses are ancient biological mechanisms. Our ancestors did not understand them, but their bodies did not need an explanation. When bacteria entered a wound, the immune system could respond. When tissue was damaged, the body could repair it. When the threat was too severe, however, the immune system could lose the battle. And this is where the ancient world became dangerous. A small cut could sometimes become something far more serious. A wound that appears minor to us could expose deeper tissue to infection. There were no modern antibiotics to stop bacterial growth. There was no sterile operating room. There was no laboratory test telling you exactly which organism was responsible. But humans still experimented. They observed what happened when wounds were cleaned, covered, protected, or treated with particular substances. We cannot always reconstruct exactly what prehistoric healers believed, and we should be careful not to project modern ideas backward. But archaeological evidence demonstrates that humans used plant materials, resins, minerals, and other natural substances for practical purposes. And later, ancient medical traditions preserved sophisticated knowledge of wound care and medicinal plants. The important point is that useful knowledge does not require a correct theory. A person does not need to know about microbes to notice that one method seems to produce better outcomes than another. This is the hidden power of experimentation. Imagine two wounds. One is left exposed and repeatedly contaminated. Another is washed, protected, and treated with a substance that happens to inhibit microbial growth. The healer may have no idea why the second patient survives more often. But if enough observations accumulate over generations, a practical tradition can emerge. The explanation may be wrong, while the treatment is still useful. Humans have always had this ability to learn from outcomes. And disease was not the only danger. Teeth could become infected. A painful tooth sounds like a small problem until the infection spreads into surrounding tissue. Archaeologists have found evidence of dental disease in prehistoric populations, including abscesses and other lesions. Some Pleistocene human remains even show dental abscesses severe enough to affect surrounding bone. Without antibiotics, a serious dental infection could become life-threatening. Yet humans continue to live long enough for dental disease to leave visible marks on their skeletons. This tells us something important. Prehistoric people did not live in a world without illness. They lived in a world where illness was woven into ordinary life. And sometimes the answer was not treatment at all. It was prevention through behavior. Food processing mattered. Fire mattered. Clean water mattered. Shelter mattered. Avoiding spoiled food mattered. The development of cooking was especially important because heating food can change its digestibility and reduce some infectious hazards. But even before people understood why heat changed food, they could notice that certain preparation methods made food more edible or safer. The same principle applied to water and living spaces. Ancient people did not know about pathogens floating invisibly through contaminated water, but they could still learn which water sources made people sick and which ones were more reliable. They could observe seasonal patterns. They could avoid stagnant pools. They could favor flowing water. They could learn from previous generations. The result was something surprisingly similar to public health, even without the scientific language we use today. But there is another mystery. If ancient humans suffered from disease, why did disease not wipe them out? Part of the answer is that infectious diseases have complicated relationships with their hosts. Some pathogens kill quickly, which can limit their own opportunities to spread. Others persist for long periods while allowing hosts to survive. Tuberculosis is an extraordinary example. It is a chronic infection that can remain within populations for long periods. And evidence from ancient remains shows a long history of interaction between humans and the tuberculosis bacterium. Researchers have proposed that the relationship between humans and major pathogens involved long-term coevolution, with both host and pathogen changing over time. But disease survival is also population survival. A single person can become sick, recover, die, or develop some degree of resistance, while the broader group continues. Across generations, natural selection favors traits that help hosts resist or tolerate infections. That does not mean ancient humans were magically immune to disease. They were not. It means that humans and pathogens were evolving together. The pathogens were changing, and human populations were changing in response. Our immune systems are partly the product of this ancient conflict. Every generation inherited biological defenses shaped by earlier encounters. But immunity was not always enough. Sometimes humans survived because they changed their environment instead. Fire could help preserve food and provide warmth. Clothing could protect skin from cold and environmental damage. Shelters could reduce exposure to weather. Group living could provide care, protection, and shared knowledge. Technology and social behavior became extensions of the human body. A wolf has claws. A bear has enormous muscles and teeth. Humans had neither. Instead, we built defenses around ourselves. We made tools, shelters, clothing, containers, and eventually medicines. The earliest version of medicine may therefore have begun not with a healer holding a plant, but with a group recognizing a problem and changing what they did next time. This is where memory becomes incredibly important. If one person discovers that a certain leaf helps a wound, that knowledge can disappear when the person dies. But if the information is taught to others, it becomes part of the group's cultural memory. The same thing can happen with food, childbirth, shelter, predators, fire, and disease. Human survival depends not only on biological evolution, but on cumulative cultural learning. One generation can inherit a solution it never personally discovered. This gives humans an unusual advantage. Evolution usually works through genetic change across many generations. Culture can change much faster. If a population discovers a useful technique, the knowledge can spread within a lifetime. That makes culture a kind of rapid adaptive system. And it helps explain why humans could survive in environments filled with dangers that our bodies alone were poorly equipped to handle. But ancient medicine was not always successful, and we should not romanticize it. Many people died from infections that would be treatable today. Many injuries that sound survivable now would once have been fatal. Childbirth could be dangerous. Severe burns, deep wounds, broken bones, dehydration, and respiratory infections could all become deadly. Our ancestors survived some extraordinary dangers, but survival should not be confused with immunity. The archaeological record contains both the people who healed and the people who did not. And because bone usually records only certain kinds of disease, the record is biased toward conditions that affect hard tissue or leave long-term marks. Many infections would have disappeared without leaving any visible trace. That means the true burden of disease in prehistoric populations was probably much larger than the skeletons alone can tell us. Yet occasionally, archaeology gives us an extraordinary glimpse of ancient people doing something that looks surprisingly medical. One example is trepanation, the intentional opening of the skull. This practice appears in archaeological contexts as far back as the Neolithic in several regions. Evidence of healing around some openings shows that people survived the procedure. In later prehistoric Peru, hundreds of trepan skulls have been studied, and researchers have found substantial survival rates, with evidence that techniques improved over time. Think about what that means. Someone was injured or suffering from a condition serious enough to justify opening the skull, and another person deliberately cut or scraped through the bone. There was no modern anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no modern understanding of infection. Yet some patients survived, sometimes even showing evidence of healing after the procedure. We must be careful here. Trepanation was not primitive brain surgery in the modern sense, and we cannot know the beliefs or intentions behind every ancient operation. But the healing bone demonstrates something extraordinary. Humans were willing to intervene directly in the body, learn from experience, refine techniques, and sometimes achieve successful outcomes. In other words, the history of medicine did not begin when humans discovered germ theory. Germ theory explained disease at a microscopic level, but practical healing existed long before the explanation. Modern medicine is built on centuries of accumulated observations, experiments, failures, and discoveries, but its deepest roots reach back much farther. They reach into the prehistoric moment when someone first noticed that a certain action changed what happened to a sick or injured person. Perhaps that is the most important lesson. Our ancestors did not survive because they understood disease. They survived because they were extraordinarily good at noticing consequences. They watched wounds heal. They watched wounds worsen. They remembered which foods made people sick. They learned where clean water could be found. They cared for people who could not care for themselves. They copied successful techniques. They passed useful information forward. And slowly, across thousands of generations, those scattered observations became traditions. Some traditions were probably ineffective. Some may even have been harmful. But successful knowledge had a powerful advantage. It tended to be repeated. This is how human culture can behave almost like an evolving system of its own. An idea that helps people survive is more likely to be remembered, taught, copied, and modified. A useful treatment can survive even when nobody understands its mechanism. A dangerous treatment may disappear if repeated failure becomes obvious. And eventually, thousands of years later, science can return to these old problems with microscopes, genetics, chemistry, and controlled experiments, replacing guesses with explanations. The truly remarkable part is how much had already been discovered before the explanation arrived. Ancient humans did not know what bacteria were. They did not know that tuberculosis was caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. They did not know that inflammation involved complex immune pathways. They did not know why wounds sometimes became infected or why certain diseases spread through populations. But they knew that sickness was real. They knew that some people recovered and others did not. They knew that injuries required care. They knew that certain environments were safer than others. And they learned how to live with uncertainty. We sometimes think of the prehistoric world as a place where humans were powerless because they lacked modern science. But that misses the more interesting story. Science is one of humanity's greatest tools, but curiosity came first, observation came first, experimentation came first, cooperation came first. The ancient person who tried something new did not have a laboratory. The group did not have a medical textbook. They had a body, an environment, other people, and memory. That was enough to begin. And perhaps the clearest evidence of their success is not that they defeated disease. They never did. The evidence is that humanity continued. Through infections, injuries, epidemics, parasites, starvation, environmental change, and countless other threats, human populations persisted and expanded into almost every major environment on Earth. We inherited bodies shaped by ancient encounters with pathogens, but we also inherited something less visible: the instinct to observe a problem, try a solution, remember the result, and teach someone else. That process began long before anyone knew what disease was. It began when humans first realized that survival was not simply about being strong enough to endure the world. It was about learning enough to change their chances. And in the end, that may be the oldest medicine of all: not understanding exactly what is killing you, but refusing to stop looking for a way to survive.